So what's up people, and welcome to another Warframe video. So aside from the Fortuna expansion and the Railjack missions, Digital Extremes has brought out their most recent extension of the Warframe lore by introducing the trailer for the new war. And as I was looking at the trailer and thinking about the contents of the most recent quest, the Sacrifice, I was starting to get some ideas with regards to where I thought Digital Extremes wanted to take the evolution of the Tenno for future gameplay. So that's why I wanted to make this video, not as a this is how it is sort of message, but mostly to make a point and ask you viewers how you felt about where this game was evolving. Now before I do the discussions, I do want to make the default disclaimer about the spoiler alert. If you haven't played Warframe, especially the quests all the way up to the Sacrifice, then there may be content in this video that may spoil your gameplay. So please watch with your discretion and decide whether you want to watch the rest of the video or not. Okay, so with that out of the way, what I did want to talk about was the recent events with regards to both the Sacrifice and the new war. So as you know, if you completed the Sacrifice, you know that the Lotus has now gone back to side with the Sentients. And of course, this is confirmed by the trailer of the new war, where it looks like the Lotus will be leading something that looks like an attack by the Sentients. And so what it looks like is in the future, the Tenno will have to deal with the invasion of the Sentients, and of course deal with this transformed Lotus. And with the release of the new trailer, there has been a lot of YouTube videos talking about the analysis of this trailer towards the future and the prediction of the future. You know, people talk about this scenery looking like the insides of a gigantic sentient. There's that statue in the background, and of course there's the new Lotus, you know, looking like her sentient self, which of course you saw at the end of the Sacrifice quest as well. You know, and so there is a good expectation that the battle will be with the invasions of these new sentients, because of course the Lotus talks about what she has to do now. There's that voice that says that you have to take what is implied to be the origin system back. And of course here you see the logo go from the Lotus symbol to an upside down broken Lotus symbol, and the old war become the new war. Yeah, and so this looks very interesting towards the future, but what I wanted to do was talk about where we have come since the past, and not focus on the Lotus or the Sentient, but really focus on the Tenno, and how the Tenno has evolved to what I think is a lot more independent state than we saw at the very beginning. And so rewinding back to the beginning of the game, at least when I started playing the game many years back, of course there was nothing with regards to the Tenno and the gameplay, and of course the logo at that time was Ninja Plays Free, which of course you sometimes see even now, but it was predominant at that time. And back then of course your character was the frame, and your avatar would change based upon the frames that you had, and you would go from one character to another, with the frames being basically the characters themselves. Now back then I would scratch my head and say, well, how can one character change themselves to so many different frame characters? But that was really not explained at the time. Also, of course, back then the Ordis was still calling you the operator, and so the developers always probably had this lore, you know, eventually coming out as you see now. But back then it was not really evident, and from my perspective, you know, I always thought the frames were the main characters, and you were basically one of these frames while you were going through these missions. So back then, you know, your basic existence was completely dependent upon the Lotus. She woke you up, and there was really no purpose for your existence except to take the orders from the Lotus and perform the various missions that occurred in the different planets in the origin system. And of course, all of this changed when Digital Extremes brought out the quest Nata. And with the release of Nata, it was the first time the gameplay started questioning the objective of the Lotus and her relation with the frames. Now, up till that point, the gameplay somewhat implied that the Lotus was the defender of the galaxy, or the guardian of the galaxy, and the Warframes were her foot soldiers that ensured that whatever her objective was fulfilled. But of course, with Nata, the origin of the Lotus and her objective was starting to become in question. And so this was the first where, people started wondering what was going on with regards to the objective of the game and who the Lotus was and what her purpose was, what she wanted to do. However, despite these changes and questions, the basic concept of the gameplay remained the same. You still took orders from the Lotus as the Warframe themselves. The focus of the gameplay was still on the frames, with no other expectation of characters to exist aside from the frames. And so, although Nata brought up some initial changes and questions to the purpose of the game, there was no major change to the actual gameplay itself. Well, all that changed with the Second Dream. As everybody knows, Second Dream changed not only the basics of the gameplay, but also the question with regards to the existence of the frames themselves. And many would come to say that with the release of the Second Dream, Warframe has evolved into a higher level of game. It was the first kind of evolution in the actual game itself. I mean, not only did it change the gameplay in a little bit, which I'll talk about later, but it also brought the game to a new kind of perspective. Up till now, the quests were considered, interesting, but not significant. Not the way the Second Dream was. The Second Dream brought Warframe's lore to a AAA level game. And so this was a significant change to the game itself. And of course, it was also a change to the gameplay itself, because now it introduced this secondary character called the Operator, or the Tenno. And for the first time, you started understanding that there was this Operator, or this Tenno. You had a physical entity associated with it. And what was interesting is many players at that time, when I was playing the first release of the Second Dream, many players got very upset over this introduction of the Operator and the Tenno. They thought that this whole Space Ninja thing was the basic theme of the game, and why were they introducing this little kid to this entire situation? But in any case, whether the players liked it or not, the Second Dream basically changed the whole perspective to what the Warframes were. I mean, for the first time, the players understood that it was not the Warframes that were considered as the Operator, but these young humanoid teenagers that came out at the end of the Second Dream quest. And back then, of course, the lore was still not well understood, so many of the players could not understand exactly who were these teenage humanoid operators, and if they were the operators, what exactly was a Warframe? Well, with the clarification that came later on, of course, we all now know that the Warframes were these technocyte-infested or infected humanoids that were created by the Orokin to fight the sentience, but by themselves could not live by themselves. They would go crazy and turn on their creators. And of course, separately, the Tenno operators were the survivors of the ill-fated Zariman 10-0 expedition into the void, and these teenagers were found, and rescued out of the void, but they also had enhanced powers, but also could not live by themselves. They were going crazy, and it was through the symbiotic relationship of the transference between the operators and the Warframes that they could finally live in harmony. And of course, the rest of the lore we all know, of how they were used as weapons, in the war against the sentients and yada, yada, yada. But in any case, with the introduction of the Second Dream, the players got a new perspective with regards to the Warframe and the relationship to the Lotus. And there was somewhat a distance now between the Warframes and the Lotus. Basically, the frames were not just silent foot soldiers for the Lotus, but basically there was now this Operator who the player can more relate to, who was somewhat a speaking and self-thinking entity that could somewhat think for themselves and had their own opinion. But despite all of that, and despite the changes in the lore, there was really not much change in the gameplay themselves. This operator was somewhat this passive entity that would sit in the pod in the orbiter, and the Warframes still went out by themselves to do all the missions. And the only major change in the gameplay came from the Focus 2.0, where the operators had a specific Tenno school of focus, and that gave additional abilities to the frames when they were going out on the missions. But despite that, you were still the frame, you still took orders from the Lotus, and basically the gameplay still remained mostly the same as it was before the Second Dreams. And this nature of gameplay remained until the introduction of the next major quest, which was the War Within. And with the introduction of the War Within, the lore became a lot more clear with regards to the Tenno. You started understanding the background of the Tenno and some of the experiences they endured while they were stranded in the void, and of course some of the consequences they had to experience once they came out of the void. And you also started understanding their relationship to somebody who they may have considered their mother at the time, which would be Margulis. And of course, with that lore clarification, the players got a little bit more understanding and relationship with the operator. They became closer to the operator by understanding what these operators were. And of course, the entire majority of the quest was played as the operator rather than the frame. And this was important because there was a major change coming up to the gameplay of the total game itself, and that now, after you finish the War Within, you could basically do many of the missions as the frame as well as the operator, since the transference can occur remotely without the need of the pod in the orbiter. The operator can now extract him or herself from the frame and basically run the missions as the operator themselves. And this was a significant importance. Of course, there was some additional skills that came up, like the Void Blast and the Void Dash, and all of those things that we now take for granted. But the most important thing for me was that there was now, again, a greater distance or a greater independence of the frames and the operator to the Lotus. So now the characters, unlike the beginning of the Warframe creation, where the frames were just these silent entities that were taking all the orders from the Lotus, you were becoming much more independent and much more vocal to what you wanted to do. And this gave, of course, greater identity to both the character of the frame as well as the operator. And this, of course, started the major independence of the operator to that of just being, a mission taker from the Lotus. And at this point, things started accelerating with the next major change coming with the introduction of the Plains of Eidolon. And this was a major gameplay change rather than a lore change, because this was the first open sandbox area of the game. All the other areas in the star map required the Lotus to give you a mission before you went there. Well, the Plains of Eidolon was a place where you could just go there on your own, and if you wanted to do nothing, you could go and basically do mining, you could go and do fishing, and you could go and do shopping. And it was one of the few areas where you could actually extract as the operator from your frame and just run around as the operator if you wanted to. And of course, none of this required basically a mission from the Lotus. And of course, any of the missions that occurred in the Plains of Eidolon were basically decided by the operator whether they wanted to take the missions offered by Kanzu or not. And in fact, there were certain regions, even in Cetus, where you had to be the operator before you could actually enter certain regions. Of course, I'm talking about the Quill headquarters. And of course, the major mission that you received in the Plains of Eidolon, which were the Eidolon hunting missions, required you to mostly be the operator throughout the majority of the mission rather than the frame. And so this really started giving a major independence of the gameplay. For once, you started feeling like you were a character independent of the basically foot soldier for the Lotus. You were basically doing a lot of the gameplay on your own and deciding on your own what sort of missions you wanted to go for. Not really as a player, but as the operator avatar in the game. And of course, from everything we see in the next major expansion, which of course is the Fortuna expansion, Digital Extremes will continue to basically create this evolutionary independence of the Tenno by creating yet more open sandbox regions on the star map. And so there seems to be this continued evolution. We started out by being basically a silent entity agent of the Lotus, and that's all we were, and somewhat the assassin or a mission taker or whatever you want to call it, that basically just got its job done and then just kept on going. But as we continued to go on, we started to understand that there was this separate identity of this operator of the Tenno, and we started becoming more and more related to the Tenno rather than the frame. And as we kept on going, we started getting more and more independence of the Tenno or the operator to that of the Lotus. And of course, this finally brings us to the most recent series of quests, which starts with the Apostasy Prologue and continues on with the Sacrifice, where we see the operator completely separated from the Lotus. Now, of course, in the Apostasy Prologue, we see the Lotus leave on her own free will, to leave the operator or the Tenno to fend for himself or herself throughout the rest of the gameplay. And of course, there is that purple Lotus or the holographic Lotus or whatever you want to call her, but that's basically a substitute. And what is understood is that the operator is now on their own to continue to fend for themselves. And this, of course, brings us to the Sacrifice, where we see at the end of the Sacrifice a sentient transformed Lotus, where the Lotus has now returned back to her sentient self. And what we see, of course, in the trailers of the new war is the sentient Lotus will most likely be the leading antagonist for that part of the gameplay. So this is a very interesting story or quest line, in that it brings the entire gameplay or the historical gameplay of Warframe to a full circle. We started out by being woken up by the Lotus, and we're basically guided with the Lotus being our savior, and it comes full circle, and then now we're having to fight the Lotus as the leader of the enemy and head of the sentient, what it looks like is the sentient invasion force. And of course, this is a very interesting idea in terms of the lore, but from my perspective, it's also a very interesting feeling, because it almost feels like it is a coming of age for the operator. In the beginning, you didn't even know that the operator existed, but eventually, you know, the operator appears. But in the beginning, it's this somewhat helpless entity which can't do anything by itself and requires the Lotus to basically take care of him or her. And of course, as it goes on, the operator continues to get more strength and more capability, and with it gains more independence, until finally it's able to separate him or herself from the Lotus. And at that point, of course, the story makes an unusual twist in that the Lotus, not only do you separate yourself and become independent from the Lotus, you are now basically expected to fight the Lotus as in the coming gameplay. And this may be, of course, how the evolution of the game is coming, in that the game will, in the future, create more and more areas where you're basically an independent entity, and there will be a lot more open sandbox type areas where you as the operator will independently determine how you want to play the game. I don't know if that will be the case, but it really does feel like Digital Extremes is basically evolving the game by evolving the operator to be the center of the area, rather than the Lotus who is giving the orders to the operator. And I think that may be a very interesting thing because it's actually a lot more appropriate to the new regions such as the plains of Eidolon as well as the Fortuna area. So yeah, I don't know if this will be how it will continue on and whether the operator will continue to gain more and more independence. And I don't know what will happen to the fate of the Lotus, whether we will have to destroy the Lotus or whether we will be able to rescue the Lotus in the future upcoming episodes. But it is interesting to see whatever happens to the Lotus and whether the Lotus comes back or not. I think there will be a significant difference in how the operator is perceived in the game as compared to the Lotus. And I think that that is a very good evolution of this game from the beginnings of what we saw of Warframe to what we see right now. And I'm kind of looking forward to seeing what Digital Extremes will bring to the future of the game and how it is perceived through the eyes of the operator and how the symbiotic relationship between the operator and the various Warframes will continue to evolve. In any case, I wanted to make this video to bring up these points and to ask you as fellow players of Warframe how you felt about the future of this game. Will the lore change where there will be a significant more independence and focus towards the operator rather than the Lotus frame relationship that we saw in the beginning of the game? And do you think the gameplay will continue to evolve such that the game will center more around the operator rather than the continuous missions that you receive from the Lotus? How do you think the game will continue to change? And do you feel that this evolution of the Tenno or the operator will continue in the future? In any case, for whoever provides these comments, thank you very much in advance. And also, thank you very much for watching this video all the way to the end. I know it was very long, and I appreciate you watching the video to this point. In any case, I look forward to your comments, and I'll continue on to make more Warframe videos in the future. And at that time, I hope you join us. And until then, happy hunting. Happy exploring, happy parkouring, or whatever. And as always, Jaya, nice day, everyone.